that this was not just about saving rivers and mountains, that this was about saving human communities. And he was able to do something to stand up to the coal industry, and that's what we need. We need people who believe in democracy, who believe in communities, and who are fearless and able to and willing to stand up to the big shots. And Ram did that for us when push came to shove. He did it for us in Appalachia. And he's about to do something in Chicago that's never been done before. This city is a maritime city. It has a maritime history. It's here because of the lake. The rivers are part of the history. They're part of any city in the United States that has wanted to rejuvenate itself and to experience a rebirth has started by cleaning up its waterfronts. And there's two great waterfronts in this city, the rivers of Chicago, which are some of the filthiest rivers in the United States, and they go through some of the poorest communities of this city. And he understands that, and he understands, we were talking a few minutes ago when he said, you know, if you clean up the river, all the property around it improves by 20%, and that's what we saw in the Hudson River. This is not just about protecting the environment, it's about protecting the infrastructure of our communities. And that's what all the river keepers and water keepers understand, is that this is a human battle, and it's a battle for our basic values, for democracy, for our moral obligation to give to our children communities that provide them with the same opportunities for dignity and enrichment and prosperity and good health as the communities that our parents gave us. And if we want to do that, we've got to start by protecting our environmental infrastructure, the air we breathe, the water we drink, the wildlife, the fisheries, the public lands, the rivers and landscapes that connect us to our past, to our history, that provide context to our communities, and that are the source ultimately of our values and our virtues and our character as a people. Now, there are a lot of people here who helped organize this event, and a lot of people here from the funding community in Chicago, and we don't have a keeper yet in Chicago, and one of our objectives in coming here is to help establish one here. So I want to just tell you very briefly about the history of this movement, which most of the keepers here are very familiar with. But it started on the Hudson River back in 1966 when a blue-collar coalition of commercial and recreational fishermen, almost all of them were former Marines, they were combat veterans from World War II in Korea, and they lived in a little fishing village 30 miles north of New York City called Crotonville. They came together in American Legion Hall to talk about violence because they saw something that they thought they owned, which was the abundance of the fisheries in the Hudson that their parents had exploited for generations. We have on the Hudson River the oldest commercial fishery in North America. It's 350 years old. Many of the people I represent come from families that have been fishing the river continuously since Dutch colonial times, and they saw it being robbed from them by large corporate entities over whom they had no control. These were people who had little expectation that they'd ever see the Tetons or Yellowstone or the Grand Canyon. For them, the environment was their backyard. It was the bathing beaches, the fishing holes, the swimming holes of the Hudson River. And this was their livelihood, it was their property values, it was their recreational opportunities, and all of these things were being stolen from them by corporate entities over whom they had no power. And they went to the government agencies that are supposed to protect Americans from pollution, to the Corps of Engineers, the State Conservation Department, and the Coast Guard, and they were given the bum's rush. They were told, at that time, Penn Central Railroad was vomiting oil from a 4.5-foot pipe in the Croton-Harmon rail yard. The oil had gone up the river and blackened the beaches and made the shad taste of diesel, so they couldn't be sold down at the Fulton Fish Market in New York City. 20 separate occasions, Richie Garrett, who was the first president of the WATERKEEPERS, who was a Korean War vet, and another Korean War vet named Art Glaucott, on 20 separate occasions went to the Corps of Engineers office in Manhattan and begged the Corps Colonel to do his job and shut down the Penn Central Pipe, which under the law he was obligated to do. But he finally told them in exasperation, these are important people. Speaking of the Penn Central Board of Directors, he said, we can't do that to them. In other words, we can't force them to obey the laws. And the laws in this country that have said that water pollution is illegal are go back to 1885. It's never been legal. This didn't happen 40 years ago when we passed the Clean Water Act. This was never legal, and he understood that. But he said these are important people, and by this evening in March of 1966, virtually everybody in Crotonville had come to the conclusion that government was in cahoots with the polluters. And the only way that they were going to reclaim the river for themselves is if they confronted the polluters directly. And somebody suggested that they put a match to the oil slick coming out of the Penn Central pipe and burn up the pipe. Somebody else said they should roll a mattress up and jam it up the pipe and flood the rail yard with its own waste. This community, Crotonville, New York, had the highest mortality rate in World War II of any community in our country. Virtually the entire male population had joined the Marines the day after Pearl Harbor. Almost all the original board members, officers, and members of WATERKEEPER were former Marines. They were combat veterans from World War II and Korea. And they were not radicals, they weren't militants, they were people whose patriotism was rooted in the bedrock of our country. But that night they were talking about violence because they saw something that they knew was illegal. But because these people were big shots, they were allowed to get away with it. And then a guy stood up whose name was Bob Boyle. Somebody suggested they float a raft of dynamite into the intake of the Indian Point power plant, which was at that time killing 1 million fish a day on its intake screens and taking food off their family tables. Somebody else said they should roll a mattress up and jam it up the Penn Central pipe and flood the rail yard with its own waste. And a guy stood up whose name was Bob Boyle. He was another Korean War vet. He was the outdoor editor of Sports Illustrated magazine. He was a famous angler and fly fisherman. He was one of the gurus of dry fly tying in this country. And he was working at Sports Illustrated, still there. He's been there for 65 years. And 2 years before, he had written an article about angling in the Hudson for Sports Illustrated. And in researching that article, he had come across an ancient navigational statute called the 1888 Rivers and Harbors Act. It said it was illegal to pollute any waterway in the United States. You had to pay a big penalty if you got caught, but also there was a bounty provision that said that anybody who turned in the polluter got to keep half the fine. And he stood up in front of these men and women when they were talking about violence, 300 people in the American Legion Hall, and he said, you know, we shouldn't be talking about breaking the law, we should be talking about enforcing it. And they resolved that evening that they were going to start a group that was then called the Hudson River Fishermen's Association. It later became Riverkeeper. They were going to go out and track down and prosecute every polluter on the Hudson. 18 months later, they collected the first bounty in United States history under this 19th century statute. They shut down the Penn Central pipe for good, and they used that money, the money they got from the bounty, $2,000, to go after Ciba-Geigy and Tuck Tape and Standard Brands and American Cyanamid. They brought dozens and dozens of lawsuits, and they won them all against the biggest polluters in America. These were people, most of them didn't have a high school education. Many of them had never voted. They never participated politically, but they did the same thing that those farmers did in Concord, Massachusetts in 1776. So they said, we are going to stand up. And they did it there, and they won. In 1973, they collected the highest penalty in United States history against a corporate polluter. They got $200,000 from Anaconda Wire and Cable for dumping toxics at Hastings, New York. They used that money to construct a boat, which they called the Riverkeeper, which today still patrols the Hudson River. They used bounty money in 1983 to hire their first full-time Riverkeeper. And they hired me as the prosecuting attorney using bounty money in 1984, and since then, we've brought over 400 successful lawsuits. We forced polluters on the river to spend about $4.5 billion, and my partner, Carl Copeland, who does most of the legal work, which I get the credit for, is here tonight, and is on our board. And today, as a result of our work, the Hudson River is the international model for ecosystem protection. This is a waterway that was a national joke in 1966. It was dead water for 20-mile stretches north of New York City, south of Albany. It caught fire, it turned color. Today, it's the richest waterway in the North Atlantic. It produces more pounds of fish per acre, more biomass per gallon than any other waterway in the Atlantic Ocean north of the equator. It's the last major river system left in the North Atlantic that still has strong spawning stocks of all of its historical species of migratory fish. It's Noah's Ark, it's a species warehouse. And the miraculous resurrection of the Hudson has inspired the creation now of 200 waterkeepers all across North America. We have them now on all of the major rivers, from Prince William Sound and Cook Inlet in Alaska, and these are people, and the Fraser River in British Columbia, the Tuolumne, the Columbia, the Willamette, Puget Sound, San Francisco Bay, Santa Monica Bay, the Orange County coast, the Santa Barbara Channel, all the way down to Laguna San Ignacio in Mexico. I think we have 29 keepers across Latin America. We're the fastest growing water protection group in the world. We have them now on most of the major rivers on the East Coast, from the Bay of Fundy in Canada down to the Biscayne Bay Keeper in Miami. And we have now, we have 17 keepers in Australia. We have a whole bunch of them in China, and if the Chinese delegation would stand up and wave to us. And we have them, and how about the Senegalese and the African delegation, if you'll stand up. We're the fastest growing water protection group in the world, and the thing that binds us together is this idea that we're not protecting the environment so much for the sake of the fish and the birds, but because we understand that it is about our community, and the polluters, the big mantra of the polluters, is that you have to choose between economic prosperity on the one hand and environmental protection on the other, and we know that is a false choice. In 100% of the situations, good environmental policy is identical to good economic policy. If we want to measure our economy, and this is how we ought to be measuring it, based upon how it produces jobs and the dignity of jobs over the generations, and how it preserves the value of the assets of our community. If, on the other hand, we want to do what the polluters want us to do, and they're indentured servants on Capitol Hill, which is to treat the planet as if it were business in liquidation, convert our natural resources to cash as quickly as possible, have a few years of pollution-based prosperity, and the illusion of a prosperous economy. And we can make a few people rich by making everybody else poor. But our children are going to pay for our joyride. And they're going to pay for it with denuded landscapes and poor health and huge cleanup costs that are going to amplify over time and that they'll never be able to pay. Environmental injury is deficit spending, and it is immoral, and it's the thing we're fighting. And I say this final thing, the best measure of how a democracy is functioning is how it distributes the goods of the land, the commons, the commonwealth, the public trust assets. Those things that cannot be reduced to private property ownership by their nature. The air, the water, the wildlife, the fisheries, the public lands, those things that are the assets of the whole community, whether you're rich or poor, black or white, young or old, humble or noble, you have an absolute right. Everybody has a right to use the Chicago River. Nobody can use it in a way that will diminish or injure its use and enjoyment by others. That's the law. It's ancient law. It goes back to Roman times. It's in the Code of Justinian. It's in the Magna Carta. It's in the Constitution of every state. And the best measure of how a democracy functions is whether it keeps those public assets in the hands of the public. The first act of a tyranny always includes efforts by powerful entities within a society to privatize the public trust assets, to make themselves rich by poisoning our fish, our waterways, our air, and our children. And what we're fighting for is not just the environment, it is the dignity of our communities, and it is the integrity of our democracy, and it is, for those of us who are part of this country, it is the mission of this country as an exemplary nation. And we need to continue to fight for those things, and we need to continue to tell everybody else what we're fighting for is not just a piece of waterway, but all the values that make us proud to be part of the human race. Thank you all very much for being here, and thank you again to Wendy Abrams and to Ron Emanuel.